What would drive a father, a king no less, to order his own son out of Clarence House in under an hour? Imagine the scene. The heavy wooden doors closing behind Prince Harry as he stepped into one of the most historic residences in London. The air thick with tension, cameras flashing outside, aides pacing the corridors, and behind it all, the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy pressing down on the fragile relationship between father and son. Does that image send a shiver down your spine? Because it should. This wasn't just a family squabble. It was a public humiliation that played out in whispers, glances, and, eventually, leaked footage that the palace never intended the world to see. Harry had flown in under the radar. No red carpets, no royal procession, just quiet anticipation that maybe, just maybe, reconciliation was possible. But here's the question. Why would King Charles even agree to meet his son if he knew, deep down, that it would end in disaster? Was it duty? Was it guilt? Or was it pressure from advisors whispering in his ear that this meeting could heal or destroy everything? That's the tightrope Charles was walking, and Harry didn't even realize he was stepping into a trap. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about the timing. Less than an hour. 54 minutes, to be exact. That's not enough time for a proper reunion, is it? It's not enough time to rebuild decades of trust, resentment, and betrayal. So why did Charles cut it short so abruptly? Was there a single trigger? Or had the decision been made before Harry even walked through the door? That's the mystery that makes this story so gripping. Because hidden in those 54 minutes is a truth that the monarchy cannot afford for the world to know. Let's rewind. Clarence House. The walls themselves have heard whispers of scandal, of strategy, of succession. Built in the early 19th century, it became the London residence of the Queen Mother for half a century. For Charles, it has always been a private sanctuary, a place where statecraft and personal life blur. For Harry, though, Clarence House symbolized something very different. His childhood memories of visiting his father, and later, a reminder of what he had walked away from. You can almost feel the clash of worlds the moment Harry entered. A man who had left the royal machine behind, now stepping into its beating heart once again. The atmosphere was reportedly suffocating. Picture it. Harry trying to break the ice with polite conversation, maybe a comment about the familiar decor or the memories they shared. But Charles, ever the monarch, not just the father, responding with guarded words. Did he greet Harry with warmth? Or with formality? Eyewitness whispers suggest that his welcome was cold, a nod more than an embrace. And right there, in those opening seconds, the reunion began to crack. How many of you have ever walked into a room hoping for forgiveness, only to be met with silence instead of love? That's the heartbreak Harry faced. Now here's where it gets more intriguing. Sources claim that the meeting began with pleasantries but quickly turned toward the one subject neither could avoid. Meghan. She wasn't in the room. She didn't need to be. Her shadow was long enough to dominate the conversation. Charles reportedly raised concerns about her influence, questioning Harry's choices, accusing him of putting the monarchy at risk. Imagine being Harry in that moment. Defensive, protective, perhaps even angry. And yet, was Charles really wrong? Or was this a father desperate to protect not just the crown, but his son from what he saw as destruction? The middle of the conversation reportedly spiraled into discussions of Diana. It's always Diana, isn't it? Her presence never fades. For Harry, she is the eternal wound. For Charles, she is the eternal accusation. When her name surfaced, emotions spiked. Harry invoking her memory as a shield. Charles bristling at the suggestion that he had failed her, or failed their sons. Can you picture that? Two generations of pain colliding across the polished oak table. It wasn't just father and son anymore. It was the ghost of a mother standing between them, demanding to be heard. And then came the moment of no return. Harry, perhaps raising his voice, perhaps losing control, said something Charles never expected to hear. The details are murky. Some say it was an accusation about Camilla. Others whisper it was a declaration that Harry no longer recognized Charles as a father, only as a monarch who had abandoned him. Whatever those words were, they pierced through the fragile facade of civility. Charles, a man known for patience in public, reportedly snapped. His temper, tightly leashed for decades, slipped free. Here's where the leaked footage changes everything. Without it, this might have remained rumor. But when the world saw Charles gesturing toward the door, his voice sharp, his command unmistakable, all doubt vanished. There was no reconciliation. There was only exile. 54 minutes in, Harry was ordered out, not as a prince, not as a son, but as an unwelcome guest. That image alone is enough to fracture the monarchy's carefully curated narrative of unity. And you have to ask yourself, why would someone inside Clarence House risk everything by leaking it? Could it have been an aide tired of the secrecy? A staffer loyal to Harry? Or was it a deliberate move by palace insiders to remind the world who truly holds the power? Think about it. Leaks aren't accidents. They're strategies. Someone wanted this story out. Someone wanted the humiliation to be public. And the fact that it spread so quickly suggests it was never about reconciliation. It was about control. Now let's pause for a moment. Put yourself in Harry's shoes, flying across the ocean, hoping to mend fences, only to be shown the door in less than an hour. What would that do to you? Would it harden your heart forever? Would it fuel your desire to expose the monarchy's secrets even more? Or would it leave you broken, realizing that home no longer exists, not even within the walls that raised you? These aren't just royal questions, they're human ones. That's why this story matters. Because behind the crowns, the titles, and the pomp, there is raw human pain. And pain has a way of breaking through the gilded cages of royalty. But let's not forget, we've only scratched the surface. Those 54 minutes were packed with tension, revelations, and betrayals that ripple far beyond Clarence House. What Charles said, what Harry replied, the letter that surfaced, the silent signals from security, the involvement of William, the reactions from Meghan. Each layer peels back another truth the monarchy would rather keep hidden. And every truth brings us closer to the collapse of the carefully constructed royal facade. So here's the cliffhanger. If Charles could so coldly cast his own son out of Clarence House, what other decisions has he made behind closed doors? And what shocking revelation pushed him to that breaking point? Because the answer to that question changes not just the story of a father and son, but the future of the monarchy itself. What shocking revelation pushed King Charles to his breaking point so fast? Was it something Harry said the moment he stepped into Clarence House? Or had the decision to end the reunion already been made before the first handshake? That's the mystery hanging in the air as we dive into what really happened during Harry's secret arrival. Picture the scene. A gray London sky, low and heavy, like even the weather knew this meeting wasn't built for sunshine. The car pulls up quietly, not through the grand main entrance, but a discreet side gate few ever notice. Why the secrecy? Why wasn't Harry's arrival announced, photographed, celebrated as a royal reunion? Because this wasn't supposed to be a spectacle. It was supposed to be a test of loyalty, a test of control, and a test that Harry would fail before the first hour was up. Now here's where things get interesting. Clarence House is no ordinary residence. Its walls have witnessed strategy meetings, royal scandals, and quiet betrayals whispered over tea. For Charles, its home and headquarters rolled into one. For Harry, walking back into it after years away must have felt like stepping into enemy territory. Do you think he hesitated at the door? Do you think, just for a second, he wondered if coming here was a mistake? That's the kind of tension that changes the energy in a room before a single word is spoken. Inside, aides had already been preparing. The halls polished to perfection, the tables set for conversation, not reconciliation. Because let's be honest, if Charles truly wanted healing, would the atmosphere have felt like an interrogation chamber? One aide later described the silence as crushing, broken only by the muffled ticking of a grandfather clock. Time mattered, every tick echoing the countdown to disaster. And Harry? He walked right into it. Eyewitness whispers say Harry's entrance wasn't greeted with warmth. No embrace, no outstretched arms, just a stiff nod from his father, a monarch who seemed more king than dad. Isn't that chilling? Imagine traveling across the ocean to mend a relationship, only to be treated like a guest in your own father's house. And yet, Harry smiled. A strained smile, sure, but one that carried hope. Maybe he thought he could break through the ice. Maybe he thought 54 minutes would be enough. But the ice was thicker than he realized. And here's the contradiction that no one talks about. Out in public, Charles presents himself as the peacemaker, the father desperate for unity. But behind closed doors, his patience wears thin. Was this meeting truly about peace? Or was it a setup designed to remind Harry of his place? Think about it. The secrecy, the timing, the cold welcome. It doesn't sound like reconciliation, does it? It sounds like Judgment Day. Harry sat down at the table. The same table where Charles has entertained prime ministers, dignitaries, even presidents. And now, across from him, not a leader of state, but his own son. Yet the formality didn't break. There were no fatherly jokes, no shared memories to warm the room. Just questions. Pressing questions. About Meghan. About the children. About loyalty. Imagine Harry's heart pounding. Imagine his hands tightening around the chair. Do you think he felt the walls closing in? But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Harry wasn't alone. Aides lingered nearby, not close enough to hear every word, but close enough to watch every move. Why? Was it protocol? Or was Charles making sure he had witnesses in case the conversation turned ugly? That detail matters, because it suggests Charles knew from the start this wouldn't end well. And if he knew that, then Harry never stood a chance. The air grew heavier as the conversation limped forward. Small talk gave way to pointed remarks. Politeness melted into sharp edges. Harry tried to steer it toward family, childhood, memories of Diana. But Charles kept steering it back to duty, to responsibility, to the crown. Isn't that telling? Harry wanted a father. Charles wanted a soldier. And that mismatch is what doomed the meeting from the beginning. The first sign of true trouble came when Harry mentioned the children. Archie and Lilibet. Charles stiffened. His questions weren't about birthdays or milestones. They were about legitimacy, appearances, the future of the monarchy. Cold. Clinical. Almost cruel. And Harry, already defensive, lashed back. That's when the temperature dropped to freezing. The idea of Clarence House as a home vanished. It became a courtroom, with Charles the judge and Harry the accused. Now pause for a moment. Put yourself in that chair. Across from a father who's also a king. Across from a man whose love feels conditional, whose approval is tied to titles and appearances. Would you fight back? Would you walk out? Or would you sit there, hoping against hope, that the man behind the crown might finally show you kindness? That's the dilemma Harry faced. And it's a dilemma no son should ever have to endure. Then came the breaking point. Charles leaned back, folded his hands, and delivered a line so sharp that even aides outside the door shifted uncomfortably. We don't know the exact words. Some say it was about Meghan. Others whisper it was about Diana. But whatever it wasn't just criticism, it was condemnation. A line that cut straight through the thin fabric of civility holding the reunion together. And Harry? His face reportedly hardened. The smile vanished. Hope drained away. And that's when everything began to unravel. Because Harry wasn't just a son trying to win back a father's love. He was a man realizing that the door to reconciliation was slamming shut, and that it was his father's hand on the handle. Clarence House had never felt more hostile. The meeting had never felt more doomed. And in that moment, Harry's secret arrival transformed into a public humiliation waiting to happen. But remember this, we're only at the beginning. The true storm hadn't even hit yet. Because if Charles could deliver words sharp enough to freeze his son, what would happen when those words gave way to action? What would happen when the king, the father, made the irreversible decision to end the reunion for good? That answer came not in days, not in hours, but in less than 54 minutes. What happens when father and son sit across from each other, not as family, but as rivals? What happens when love, blood, and duty collide in the same room, and every unspoken word becomes a weapon? That was the atmosphere in Clarence House once the fragile politeness shattered and father versus son stood exposed in raw, undeniable tension. Charles leaned forward. Harry stiffened in his chair. No matter how hard either tried, the small talk had dissolved into something darker. And here's the irony. Both had come into the room hoping for control. Charles, as the king, wanted order, respect, and loyalty. Harry, as the son cast into exile, wanted acknowledgement, validation, and, maybe, a sliver of affection. But neither was willing to bend. And when two immovable forces collide, what's left but destruction? Think about the body language. Charles's jaw set tight, his hands clasped together like he was holding back words he knew could scorch. Harry, shifting uncomfortably, eyes flashing with the fire of someone who'd had enough of lectures. This wasn't a warm reunion. It was a duel. Every sentence Charles spoke felt like a judgment. Every response Harry gave was a rebuttal. The room became a courtroom, but there was no judge, no jury, just father and son fighting for the final word. It started small. Charles asking about Harry's life in America. At first glance, that might sound like interest. But dig deeper, and you'll see it wasn't about family, it was about optics. Questions like, are you financially stable? Do you intend to continue your projects with Netflix? Polite words, but sharpened like knives. Harry caught the tone immediately. He didn't hear curiosity. He heard accusation. And that's when his responses grew shorter, his tone more clipped. He knew this wasn't about care. It was about control. And then, Meghan. Always Meghan. Her name dropped into the conversation like a bomb. Charles didn't say it harshly at first, but the subtext was clear. She's changed you. She's pulled you away. She's the reason we're here in this mess. Can you imagine how those words landed? For Harry, Meghan wasn't just his wife, she was his lifeline. The one person who'd stood by him when he broke free of the palace machine. To hear his father imply she was poison? That was enough to snap the thin thread of patience holding him together. Harry's voice rose. Not shouting yet, but enough that aides outside the door reportedly shifted uneasily. His defense was fierce. He spoke of love, of independence, of the right to choose his own path. He reminded Charles of Diana's struggles, of her loneliness, of how history seemed to be repeating itself with Meghan. Do you see the contradiction? Harry believed he was defending his family. Charles believed Harry was attacking the monarchy. Two truths colliding, neither willing to concede. Now pause for a moment. Ask yourself this. If you were Charles, sitting there, hearing your son invoke the ghost of Diana, would you feel guilt or anger? Would you see it as a plea for understanding, or as a knife twisted in an old wound? That's the contradiction that makes this scene so volatile. Because Charles didn't respond with softness. He responded with sharpness. His words cut back. He spoke of loyalty to the crown. He spoke of duty over desire. And then, most chillingly, he accused Harry of betrayal. That word, betrayal, once spoken, it hung in the air like smoke. Harry's eyes reportedly widened. Betrayal? This was his father. Betrayal of what? Betrayal of family, or betrayal of monarchy. The lines were blurred, and maybe that was the point. Charles couldn't separate the two. To him, Harry leaving the royal fold wasn't just independence, it was treason. And treason, in Charles's eyes, could never be forgiven. The energy in the room shifted. No longer was this a tense reunion, it was a standoff. Harry leaned forward now, no longer trying to be polite. His hands gestured sharply as he reminded Charles of the years of silence when he and Meghan begged for help, of the headlines that nearly destroyed her mental health, of the palace's refusal to protect them the way it protected others. Every word dripping with frustration, every phrase laced with years of bottled rage. And Charles? He sat still, eyes hard, as though every accusation rolled off his shoulders. But inside he was boiling. Because here's the twist. Charles wasn't angry about Meghan alone. He was angry about the world watching, about the press, the documentaries, the interviews. To him, Harry wasn't just a son gone rogue. He was a weapon in the hands of outsiders. And the idea that his son might expose secrets too dangerous for the crown? That was the true betrayal. That was what made Charles's blood run cold. The contradictions only deepened. Harry insisted he was protecting his family. Charles insisted Harry was destroying his. Both believed they were right. Both believed they were victims. And in that clash, reconciliation became impossible. Every line spoken only pushed them further apart, until the gap between father and son wasn't just emotional. It was unbridgeable. At one point, Charles reportedly slammed his hand on the table. Not hard enough to break decorum, but enough to send a shock through the room. Harry flinched. Aides glanced at one another. That small gesture carried centuries of royal authority. It wasn't just a father saying enough. It was a king demanding obedience. And Harry? He didn't bow. He didn't bend. He stared back, unyielding. That was the moment the room froze. Father versus son. King versus prince. Love versus loyalty. Now let me ask you, have you ever felt trapped in a conversation where no matter what you said, the other person twisted it, turned it, used it against you? That's the corner Harry found himself in. Every defense became another accusation. Every plea became another sign of weakness. And the more he fought, the more Charles hardened. It was a cycle spinning out of control. And somewhere deep down, both men knew there was no way back. The voices grew louder, the words sharper. It wasn't just conversation anymore, it was combat. And as the minutes ticked by, Clarence House became less a home and more a battlefield. 54 minutes. That's all it took. 54 minutes to rip apart what little hope remained. 54 minutes for Charles to make the decision that would stun the world. But before that decision came, there was one moment, one remark, that crossed a line neither had dared to cross before. A remark so personal, so devastating, that it silenced even the ticking of the clock. And when those words were spoken, reconciliation died on the spot. What if the person who wasn't even in the room controlled every breath of the conversation? What if the silence in Clarence House was filled by a presence thousands of miles away? Meghan Markle wasn't there. She didn't need to be. Her name alone was enough to shatter what little peace existed between father and son. And when it surfaced, the atmosphere went from tense to explosive. Imagine this. The polished oak table between them, Charles's fingers tapping lightly, Harry's jaw set tight. For a moment, the words hung in the air like smoke. Meghan. One word, but it carried more weight than an entire speech. Because Meghan wasn't just Harry's wife. She was the symbol of everything that had driven him away, the freedom, the rebellion, the exposure of palace secrets. For Charles, her name meant risk. For Harry, it meant loyalty. And that single contradiction was enough to send sparks flying. Charles didn't shout. That's what makes this even more cutting. He spoke with cold precision, each word chosen like a blade. He accused Meghan of pulling Harry away from his family, of fueling his anger, of manipulating his choices. Can you imagine how that landed? For Harry, Meghan wasn't poison. She was salvation. She was the one who listened when no one else did, the one who held him together when he nearly fell apart. To have his father reduce her to an enemy? That was unforgivable. Harry's defense was immediate, fierce, almost desperate. He raised his voice now, his words tumbling out with raw emotion. He painted a picture of the dark days when Meghan confessed she didn't want to live anymore. He reminded Charles of the headlines that ripped her apart while the palace said nothing. He pleaded for understanding, for compassion. But here's the cruel twist. Charles didn't flinch. His silence was colder than words. And isn't silence sometimes the loudest condemnation of all? Now think about the irony. Charles once fought against the establishment to be with Camilla. He once endured criticism, whispers, and headlines that tore him apart. And yet here he was, turning that same judgment against his son's wife. Do you see the contradiction? The father who wanted freedom and love now denying his son that same right. That's the kind of hypocrisy that destroys families from the inside out. The argument escalated. Harry, pacing now, hands gesturing wildly, words spilling faster than he could control. Charles, sitting firm, his face a mask of authority. Their voices rising, echoing off the walls of Clarence House. Aides outside the door exchanged nervous looks. They weren't just hearing a family disagreement. They were hearing history being torn apart, brick by brick. And Meghan's name was at the center of it all. Let me ask you, if someone you loved more than anything was being attacked in front of you, how far would you go to defend them? Would you risk everything? Even your relationship with your own father? That's the knife Harry found himself holding. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not when Meghan's honor was at stake. And so he fought harder, louder, until the room itself seemed to tremble with the weight of his anger. And yet, Charles wasn't simply speaking as a father. He was speaking as a king. To him, Meghan wasn't just Harry's wife. She was a threat to the crown, a figure who disrupted tradition, destabilized perception, and invited chaos into centuries of control. To Charles, Meghan represented rebellion. To Harry, she represented survival. That clash of perspectives was unresolvable. Neither could understand the other. Neither wanted to. But here's the most chilling part. Some insiders claim Charles said something no father should ever say. That Meghan didn't belong. That she would never be truly accepted. That no matter how much Harry fought, she would remain an outsider. Can you imagine hearing that? Can you imagine the rage that would swell in your chest? Harry's eyes reportedly blazed. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, nearly trembling with fury. He told Charles that Meghan wasn't just his wife, she was his family. And if the crown couldn't accept her, then maybe he couldn't accept the crown. That line, that declaration, it silenced the room. Because in that moment, Harry wasn't just defending his wife. He was drawing a line in the sand. Him and Meghan on one side, the monarchy on the other. And Charles knew, deep down, that once that line was drawn, there was no erasing it. 54 minutes into the reunion, the rift was deeper than ever before. Now here's the twist no one expected. Some whispers say that Meghan wasn't just mentioned, she was present in a different way. That Harry had received a message from her during the meeting. That aides caught a glimpse of his phone lighting up on the table, her name flashing across the screen. If that's true, can you imagine how Charles reacted? Seeing Meghan's presence intrude on Clarence House itself, as if she were there in spirit, fueling Harry's resolve, it would have been enough to make his blood boil. And this raises a darker question. Was the meeting doomed from the start because Meghan was always going to be the invisible third person in the room? Father, son, and wife. The triangle that tore apart a monarchy's carefully guarded image. Charles wanted his son. Harry wanted his wife. And in that tug-of-war, love and loyalty twisted into chains neither could break free from. The voices grew louder. The accusations sharper. Harry accusing his father of abandoning him. Charles accusing Harry of betraying him. All roads leading back to Meghan. Every sentence dripping with pain, with history, with resentment. The Crown on one side, California on the other. Clarence House wasn't just hosting a reunion anymore. It was hosting a battle for Harry's soul. And just when the argument reached its peak, when Harry's voice cracked with fury and Charles's eyes narrowed with disdain, something shifted. A silence fell. Heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that follows words too dangerous to repeat. Because Charles had just said something Harry couldn't forgive. Something so personal, so cruel, that it crossed the line forever. And in that silence, Harry realized the truth. He wasn't welcome. Not here. Not anymore. Not as long as Meghan's name shadowed his every move. But what Charles revealed next, the detail about Diana's legacy that tied Meghan's story to the past, was even more explosive. And it would leave Harry reeling in ways he never expected. What could be more haunting than a name that refuses to fade? Diana. The very mention of her changed everything inside Clarence House. It was as though the walls themselves trembled. Father and son were already at war over Meghan, but when Diana's legacy surfaced, the reunion turned into something much darker. Because Diana wasn't just Harry's mother. She was Charles's greatest wound, his most enduring ghost, and the one truth that could never be buried. Imagine the silence when her name was spoken. The tension paused for just a second, but it wasn't relief. It was the heavy silence of a battlefield before the next explosion. Harry invoked her with passion, his voice rising, his hands trembling. He told Charles that Meghan reminded him of Diana. The isolation, the cruelty of the press, the way the palace ignored her pleas. He looked straight into his father's eyes and said, "You let it happen to her, and now you're letting it happen again." Think about the weight of those words. That's not just accusation. That's judgment. That's a son calling out his father for failing the one woman who meant everything to him. And for Charles, it was like a knife twisting in wounds that had never healed. Because no matter how many years had passed, no matter how many times he tried to rewrite history, Diana's shadow always loomed. She was there in every headline, every comparison, every crack in the royal facade. And now, in Clarence House, she was back again. Summoned by Harry as both weapon and shield. Charles's reaction? Not soft, not apologetic, not paternal. He snapped. His voice, normally measured and controlled, cracked with something sharper, anger, maybe even guilt. He accused Harry of weaponizing his mother's memory. He told him that Diana's story was tragic, yes, but that it had been twisted by Harry to justify every reckless move. Can you imagine the fury in Harry's chest? To him, invoking Diana wasn't manipulation. It was truth. It was history repeating itself in the cruelest way. But for Charles, it was betrayal, his son daring to bring back ghosts he had spent decades trying to bury. And here's the cruel contradiction. Charles loved Diana in his way, but his love was messy, complicated, overshadowed by Camilla and by the demands of the monarchy. He couldn't protect her. He didn't protect her. And Harry knew that. For Harry, Diana was the mother who hugged him, who whispered comfort, who shielded him when the cameras grew too close. For Charles, Diana was the reminder of failure, of scandal, of a marriage that broke the monarchy's illusion of perfection. So when her name surfaced, it wasn't just a conversation, it was a battlefield of memory. Harry pressed harder. He reminded Charles of Diana's interviews, her pain, her confessions about being silenced and ignored. He demanded to know why his father hadn't stepped in, why history was now repeating itself with Meghan. And Charles? He grew colder, harder, as if the only way to survive was to bury the emotions Harry was trying to dig up. He told Harry that Diana's way of handling the crown had been destructive, not protective, that her legacy was complicated, that Meghan would never, be Diana. Can you feel the sting in those words? Because Harry did. The clash wasn't just about Meghan anymore. It was about the soul of Diana's memory. Harry saw her as a martyr. Charles saw her as a cautionary tale. And between those two interpretations lay an ocean of grief, anger, and misunderstanding that no amount of reconciliation could bridge. The father who failed to protect her. The son who vowed never to let that failure repeat. Both men staring across the table, neither willing to surrender their truth. And then, here's where the whispers become even darker. Charles revealed something Harry had never heard before. Some say it was a private letter Diana wrote, one that Charles had kept locked away for years. Others claim it was a confession she made to him in her darkest moments. Whatever it was, the effect on Harry was devastating. His face reportedly went pale, his eyes wide. The revelation cut deep, not because it destroyed his memory of Diana, but because it complicated it. Because it showed her not just as victim, but as something else. Something more fragile. Something more broken. And Harry wasn't ready to hear that from his father. Think about that for a moment. The woman Harry had idolized as a symbol of truth and love suddenly painted with a different brush by the man who had once hurt her most. Was Charles telling the truth? Or was this a strategic move, a way to weaken Harry's argument, to shatter his foundation by twisting Diana's memory? That's the kind of mind game that changes a conversation forever. Because once doubt enters the picture, nothing is solid anymore. Harry lashed back. His voice cracked, not with weakness, but with rage. He told Charles he would never forgive him for using Diana's memory against him. He accused him of rewriting history to protect his crown. His words poured out like a flood, unstoppable, emotional, raw. And Charles? He grew still. His silence now wasn't cold, it was calculating. As though he knew he had struck the blow that changed everything. As though he had decided that this reunion was no longer salvageable. And here's the heartbreaking truth. For years, Diana had been the thread connecting father and son. She was the shared grief, the common pain, the one bond that could have united them. But in Clarence House that day, her name didn't heal. It divided. It became a wall instead of a bridge. And once that wall went up, neither Charles nor Harry could climb over it. So let me ask you, if the memory of a mother can't unite a father and son, what hope is there for reconciliation? If Diana's ghost, powerful and beloved, only deepened the rift, then what chance does Meghan have? What chance does the monarchy have? These are the questions that Clarence House left unanswered. But one thing was clear. The clash over Diana's legacy was the final nail in the coffin of that reunion. And as Harry sat there, seething, heart pounding, fists clenched, he knew the conversation was slipping beyond repair. Because what Charles said next didn't just attack Meghan or Diana. It attacked Harry himself. It questioned his loyalty, his honesty, his trustworthiness. It was the accusation Harry had feared all along. And the proof Charles claimed to have, the evidence he was about to put on the table, would change everything. Betrayal. It's one thing to argue. It's one thing to disagree. But to look your own son in the eye and accuse him of betraying you, that's a line most fathers never dare to cross. Yet in Clarence House, Charles crossed it. And once he did, there was no going back. The reunion was no longer tense. It was toxic, poison dripping into every word, every glance, every second that passed until those 54 minutes ran out. Charles leaned forward, his voice low, almost cold enough to freeze the air itself. He told Harry that he could no longer be trusted. Trusted with private conversations. Trusted with royal secrets. Trusted, even, with the family's survival. Can you feel the weight of that? It wasn't just disappointment. It was exile disguised as words. It was a father saying, "You are no longer one of us." And Harry? He sat there stunned, his face burning, his mind racing. Because for him, Loyalty had always meant protecting his wife and children. But for Charles, loyalty meant obedience. And those two definitions could never coexist. Let's not sugarcoat it. Charles was accusing Harry of being a spy. Not literally, perhaps, but symbolically. He accused him of carrying their private life into the hands of the press, the streaming platforms, the tell-all books. He accused him of selling the family's dignity for the world's applause. Imagine how those words must have cut Harry open. After all, hadn't he begged the family to listen before he spoke to the cameras? Hadn't he asked for help before stepping onto the world stage? And when he was ignored, what choice did he have but to tell his story his own way? Yet here he was, painted as Judas at the royal table. The accusations weren't vague. They were sharp. Charles pointed to specific incidents, leaks that appeared in the press, headlines that mysteriously aligned with conversations Harry had been privy to, deals with media giants that made Charles question his son's motives. And Harry, desperate, denied it all. His voice cracked with anger, frustration, desperation. He insisted he hadn't betrayed anyone, that he had only spoken truth the palace wanted buried. But truth is a dangerous thing in royal circles. Because in their world, the truth isn't what happened. It's what they say happened. And here's where the betrayal deepened. Charles didn't just question Harry's loyalty to the family. He questioned his loyalty to Diana's memory. Yes, you heard that right. He suggested that Harry had twisted his mother's legacy into a weapon, using her story not to honor her, but to attack the crown. That was the cruelest cut of all. Because for Harry, Diana was the only anchor he had left. To accuse him of betraying her was to rip away the one piece of solid ground beneath his feet. His response was explosive, his voice rising, trembling, echoing off the walls. He told Charles that if betrayal existed, it was the palace that betrayed Diana, not him. But Charles's face remained stone. He didn't flinch. He didn't bend. He simply stared, silent, as though the accusation only confirmed his worst suspicions. And then, the moment that broke it all. A knock on the door. Aides stepping inside, carrying something. A folder. A file. Evidence, they claimed. Proof that Harry could not be trusted. Can you imagine the dread in that room? The father sitting smug, certain he was about to expose his son. The son sitting furious, waiting to see what falsehood was about to be thrown in his face. The aides placed the file on the table. Charles slid it across to Harry. "Read it," he said, his tone sharp, commanding. A king's tone, not a father's. Harry opened the folder. Inside were clippings, reports, transcripts of conversations that had somehow ended up in the hands of journalists. Notes of things Harry had said privately, later echoed in documentaries or interviews. To Charles, this was proof. To Harry, it was manipulation. Because how many leaks come from within the palace itself? How many whispers are planted by courtiers, advisors, even other royals? But Charles refused to see it. To him, the line was clear. Harry spoke. The world listened. The monarchy suffered. Betrayal, plain and simple. Harry slammed the file shut, his voice rising now to a near shout. He told his father that he had been set up, that the leaks came not from him, but from those closest to Charles, that the palace machine fed the press whenever it suited them, sacrificing Harry and Meghan to protect others. He named names. He called out Camilla's aides. He hinted at William's inner circle. Each word was a spark, and Clarence House was about to catch fire. Because accusing the future king, accusing the queen consort, that wasn't just anger. That was treason in Charles's eyes. Do you see the contradiction? Charles claimed betrayal, but Harry accused him of betrayal right back. Both men pointing fingers, both men refusing to back down. And in that storm of accusations, something inside Charles broke. His face reddened, his fists clenched. For years, he had tolerated whispers, criticisms, even mockery. But to be accused of betraying Diana's memory and leaking against his own son? That was too much. His patience snapped like a bowstring pulled too tight. The aides shifted uneasily. The atmosphere was suffocating. Harry's voice cracked as he shouted, "I trusted you." Charles fired back. "And you destroyed us." There it was. The final exchange. The cutting of the cord. Father and son, not just estranged, but enemies locked in a battle that could only end one way. Now pause and think. Have you ever had someone you love accuse you of something so vile, so unforgivable, that you knew the relationship could never be the same again? That's the moment Harry lived. That's the moment Charles chose to burn the bridge instead of rebuild it. And from that moment on, every second that ticked toward the 54th minute was just waiting for the inevitable end. But the story doesn't stop there. Because the betrayal wasn't just spoken, it was written. A letter. A letter Charles had kept hidden. A letter that carried a revelation so powerful that when it surfaced, it changed Harry's understanding of everything. And when that letter landed on the table, a letter. A single sheet of paper. Ink faded with time, yet heavy with secrets. That's what Charles reached for next, as if words written long ago could serve as the final blow. In a room already charged with betrayal, the unveiling of this letter wasn't just a move, it was a weapon. And when it landed on the table between them, Harry knew he was about to confront something he had never seen before. Something that could change everything he thought he knew about his mother, his father, and himself. Why now? Why bring this letter into the open after decades of silence? Was Charles desperate to win the argument? To silence Harry once and for all? Or was this his way of rewriting history, by using Diana's own words as ammunition? Imagine the contradiction. A father pulling out a letter from the woman who haunted their every conversation, wielding it against the son who worshipped her memory. That's not reconciliation. That's annihilation. Harry's hands trembled as he picked it up. The envelope, slightly crinkled. The handwriting, unmistakable. Diana's flowing script leaping off the page like a voice from the grave. Can you imagine the surge of emotion? The hope that maybe, just maybe, it would be a message of love, of comfort, of something to soothe the chaos of the moment? But instead, what Harry read cut him deeper than any argument could. The letter wasn't long, just a page. But the words, if palace insiders are to be believed, spoke of fear. Fear for her sons. Fear of being silenced. Fear of manipulation within the walls of the monarchy. She wrote of feeling trapped, of not knowing who to trust. And here's the chilling twist. She hinted that her story might one day be twisted, even by those closest to her. She feared her truth would be buried under the weight of royal survival. Now think about that. Harry reading his mother's words, written decades before, predicting the very pain he was feeling at that table. Do you see the tragedy? Diana's fears weren't just her own. They became Harry's reality. But that wasn't the part that crushed him. The real shock was Charles's interpretation. He leaned forward, his voice calm, almost too calm, and said, "She knew this path would destroy us. And you are proving her right." Can you imagine that? Taking a mother's desperate warning and using it not to protect her son, but to condemn him? Harry's chest tightened. His eyes filled with rage, maybe even tears. To him, Diana's letter was a cry for help, a message of truth. To Charles, it was evidence. Proof that Harry's actions weren't heroic, but dangerous. Now pause. Ask yourself this. Who was right? Was Diana warning Harry to stay silent for survival, or urging him to speak for freedom? Was Charles interpreting the letter honestly, or bending its meaning to break his son's spirit? That ambiguity is what makes this moment so devastating, because the truth may never be clear. And in the fog of that uncertainty, trust completely collapsed. Harry slammed the letter onto the table. His voice rose, sharp, trembling. He told Charles that he had no right to use Diana's words against him, that her letter was not a weapon, that she had written it out of love, out of fear for her sons, not as justification for silencing them. His words poured out like fire, each one fueled by the memory of the mother he lost too soon. And Charles? He remained still, cold, his silence saying more than words ever could. Because silence in that moment wasn't restraint, it was victory. The silence of a man who believed he had won. But Harry wasn't done. His voice cracked as he reminded his father of nights he cried for his mother, of moments when Diana was the only light in a dark childhood. He told him that the monarchy's survival meant nothing if it destroyed the people within it. His fists clenched, his body shook. And yet, Charles's face stayed unmoved. A mask. A king's mask, not a father's. That's what broke Harry most. Not the letter, not the accusations, but the realization that his father was no longer a father at all. And then came the cruelest twist of all. Some whispers suggest that the letter didn't just contain warnings. It contained names, hints at people Diana didn't trust, people she believed would one day betray her sons. And when Charles pointed to those names, Harry reportedly froze. Because one of them was someone Harry trusted. Someone close. The letter wasn't just a message from the past. It was a crack in the present, a seed of doubt planted in Harry's mind that would haunt him forever. Can you imagine the paranoia? The confusion? The heartbreak of realizing that your mother might have foreseen betrayals you hadn't even considered? That's the kind of revelation that doesn't just end a meeting. It destroys relationships. It plants shadows that never fade. And for Harry, in that moment, Clarence House became less a home and more a mausoleum, filled not with reconciliation, but with ghosts and daggers disguised as ink. By now, the minutes were slipping away. The 54-minute mark loomed closer, and Harry knew it. His voice lowered, almost whispering now, as he told his father, "You've lost me." And Charles, with eyes like ice, gave no reply. Just a flick of the hand. A gesture that said everything. Dismissal. Rejection. End. But before security could be summoned, before the silence could swallow the room, something else happened. A shadow moved in the corner. An aide, hesitating, then leaning toward Charles. A whisper exchanged. A signal given. And Harry, watching closely, realized something terrifying. Security had been preparing for this from the moment he arrived. And at that moment, Harry understood. This wasn't a reunion. It was a setup, a performance designed to end exactly this way. What would you do if you realized the room you walked into had been prepared not for reconciliation, but for your removal? That's the realization that hit Harry as he noticed the subtle gestures, the almost invisible signals being exchanged between Charles's aides and Clarence House security. He thought he was walking into a reunion with his father. But from the very beginning, every second of those 54 minutes had been moving him toward the door. It started small. A shift in posture from the guard in the corner. A discreet hand to an earpiece. The faintest glance exchanged with an aide leaning against the doorway. Nothing loud. Nothing obvious. But to Harry, a man trained in military observation, it was unmistakable. Security wasn't relaxed. They were on alert. Waiting. Ready. And that's when the chilling truth struck him. Charles hadn't come here to heal the rift. He had come here to stage the final act of exile. Think about that for a moment. A father summoning his son to Clarence House, not for peace, but for humiliation. Why else would security be briefed so thoroughly? Why else would signals be practiced in advance? Reconciliation doesn't require bodyguards exchanging coded looks. Reconciliation doesn't need an exit strategy. But an ambush? That's another story. The conversation at the table grew heated. Words like betrayal, loyalty, duty still hung in the air, clinging to the walls like smoke. Harry's voice shook with anger. Charles's tone hardened with cold authority. But beneath the sound of their clash, the quiet hum of radio static slipped through the silence. A guard's hand twitched against his belt. Another edged a step closer to the door. It was theater, carefully choreographed. And Harry, finally, saw the strings. Here's the irony. Clarence House had always been a fortress for Charles. A place where he could host ministers, negotiate with world leaders, and plan royal strategy. But that day, it wasn't strategy. It was entrapment. Harry had walked in believing he still had the agency of a son. But what he found instead was the cold reality of the monarchy as machinery, every cog in place, every action rehearsed. Fatherhood had been replaced by protocol. And protocol doesn't forgive. It removes. Pause for a moment. Have you ever realized you were the only person in a room without a script? That everyone else knew the ending, and you were just acting out your part without knowing it? That's the nightmare Harry stepped into. He wasn't the protagonist of this scene. He was the target, the pawn. And Clarence House, the place that once held childhood memories of Diana's laughter and family dinners, was now a stage for his father's quiet, calculated rejection. The signs grew clearer. The aide who whispered into Charles's ear leaned back, his hand signaling with a barely perceptible nod. A guard straightened. Another touched the inside of his jacket, not for a weapon, but for the discreet radio clipped beneath. And Harry realized he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, out of time. This wasn't going to be a father telling a son to leave. This was going to be a king ordering the removal of a dissident. And here's the twist. Some insiders whisper that the leaked footage doesn't just show Charles's gesture toward the door. It shows the moment the silent signal was given. The precise second when father-son conflict turned into royal protocol. That's why the footage matters so much. Because it proves this wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated. Harry's heart pounded. His instincts sharpened. The soldier in him scanned every detail, the exit points, the positioning of guards, the way the aides had shifted closer to the door as though anticipating his departure. He wasn't just in an argument anymore. He was in containment, and that realization brought a sickening clarity. Charles never intended this to last longer than 54 minutes. The meeting had an expiration date written in invisible ink the moment Harry walked in. Now ask yourself, what would you do if your own father staged your removal like a security threat? Would you plead? Would you fight? Or would you accept that the relationship was beyond saving? Harry sat frozen, torn between rage and disbelief, as Charles finally leaned back in his chair, eyes cold, voice steady. He gave no direct order, just a glance toward the aide, just a flick of the wrist. Subtle, almost invisible, but in the monarchy, subtle gestures carry the weight of law. And with that, the decision was made. The guard shifted. One stepped forward, only slightly, as though preparing for the moment he'd be called upon. Another placed a hand on the door, ready to open it the second Harry was dismissed. Their movements were smooth, silent, disciplined. Not aggression, but inevitability. The machine was in motion. And Harry knew it. That's when the true betrayal sank in. Not just his father's words, not just the letter, but the realization that this had never been a conversation. It had been an execution of trust. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because some claim Harry wasn't supposed to notice the signals. He wasn't supposed to see the glance, the nod, the subtle choreography of power. But he did. And that awareness changed everything. Because when a son realizes his father has treated him as an intruder in his own home, there's no going back. The clock ticked toward the 54th minute. Harry's breath grew heavier. Charles's face remained still. The aides stiffened, waiting for the final command. And then it came, not with shouting, not with anger, but with cold dismissal. Charles raised his hand, pointed toward the door, and said words that history will remember not as a father's plea, but as a king's decree. It's time you left. And in that moment, Harry wasn't just a son cast out. He was a prince stripped of belonging. A man severed from the one place he thought reconciliation might still exist. Clarence House didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like exile. But here's the cliffhanger. The leaked footage that captured this moment didn't just reveal Charles's cold command. It revealed the humiliation, the gestures, the silence of security preparing to escort him out like a trespasser. And when the world saw it, the narrative shattered. This wasn't just a family rift. It was monarchy unmasked. And what happened in those final seconds, when the clock struck 54 minutes, was even more brutal than anyone expected. 54 minutes. That was all it took. Not an hour. Not even enough time to finish the tea that had been poured into delicate porcelain cups at the start of the meeting. Just 54 minutes from the moment Harry stepped into Clarence House to the second Charles decided his son no longer belonged there. And the way it happened wasn't just abrupt, it was brutal. Picture it. The grandfather clock in the corner chiming softly, marking time like a silent judge. Harry still mid-sentence, his voice sharp with frustration, his words spilling out faster than he could contain them. Charles no longer listening. His face pale, jaw tight, hands gripping the arms of his chair like he was holding himself back from something. And then, suddenly, he moved. Charles leaned forward, eyes cold, and raised his hand. Not high, not dramatic, just enough. A flick of the wrist, a glance toward the aide standing by the door. And in that gesture, the meeting ended. 54 minutes in, Charles gave the unspoken order. Enough, he said. One word, but it landed like a hammer. Harry froze. For a heartbeat, he didn't believe it. Didn't want to believe it. He thought maybe his father was bluffing. Maybe he'd soften. Maybe he'd let the moment pass. But Charles didn't soften. He doubled down. His voice sharpened. It's time you left. Not let's pause. Not we'll talk later. Just exile, cold and final, delivered in less than a sentence. Now let me ask you, have you ever been cut off mid-word, dismissed before you could explain yourself? The sting of that? Multiply it by 1,000, because Harry wasn't just a man being dismissed. He was a son being thrown out by his father. He was a prince being told by his king that his presence was no longer tolerated. The room shifted instantly. Security, already on silent alert, moved closer. A guard's hand touched the door handle. Another stepped subtly forward, just enough for Harry to notice. The aides stiffened, their faces blank, trained not to betray emotion. It was mechanical, cold, efficient, the choreography of removal. Harry's voice cracked as he pushed back. "You can't mean this," he said, his words half plea, half protest. His eyes searched his father's face for even a flicker of softness. But Charles's expression didn't change. His silence was louder than shouting. He wasn't just ending the conversation. He was closing a chapter of their lives. Think about the contradiction here. Charles had waited years for his son to return. The public had begged for reconciliation. The monarchy itself depended on the image of unity. And yet, in less than an hour, Charles destroyed it all. Why? Was it rage? Was it pride? Or had this been planned from the start? The 54th minute marked on the clock before Harry even walked in. The humiliation burned. Harry rose from his chair, his hands trembling, his chest heaving. He looked around the room, at the aides who wouldn't meet his eyes, at the guards already preparing to open the door, at his father who sat still, unyielding. And in that moment, Harry realized something devastating. This wasn't just a dismissal. It was a message, a performance designed to strip him of dignity, to remind him of where he stood. Because let's be clear, when a king throws his son out of Clarence House, it's not private. The walls may not speak, but the people inside them do. Someone would leak it. Someone would ensure the world knew. And that's exactly what happened. The footage that later emerged showed it all. Charles's hand gesture, Harry's stunned expression, the cold efficiency of security. 54 minutes condensed into a symbol of a family tearing itself apart. Harry's voice rose one last time. "This isn't family. This is cruelty." His words hung in the air like smoke. But Charles didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just looked at his son and said, "You've made your choices. Now live with them." Imagine hearing that from your own father. The finality of it. The cruelty of it. It wasn't advice. It was a sentence. The guard opened the door. The sound echoed through the room, louder than it should have. The meeting was over. The reunion had failed. And Harry, the son who came in hoping for peace, walked out with humiliation burning in his chest. He didn't storm out. He didn't shout. He walked with his head high, but inside, he was breaking. Because in those 54 minutes, the last thread of connection between father and son had been severed. And here's the chilling part. The world wouldn't have known the exact brutality of that moment if not for the leaked footage. Without it, Clarence House could have spun the story. They could have said the meeting was amicable, that both parties agreed to continue conversations. But the footage stripped away the lie. It showed the truth, the king ordering his son out like an intruder. That's why the story exploded. That's why it mattered. But the real question is, who leaked it? Footage that's sensitive, that incriminating, doesn't just slip into the public by accident. Someone inside Clarence House wanted the world to see it. Someone wanted to expose Charles's cruelty or Harry's humiliation, or both. And the identity of that person changes everything. Because if it was a staffer loyal to Harry, it shows sympathy in the shadows of the monarchy. But if it was a palace insider working for Charles, it shows something even darker, that the dismissal wasn't just private discipline. It was public execution, orchestrated for the world stage. And that's where the story takes its next shocking turn. Because the footage didn't just humiliate Harry. It destabilized the monarchy itself. And once the footage went public, the fallout was unstoppable. The world wasn't supposed to see it. The cameras in Clarence House weren't meant for public eyes. They were there for protocol, for security, for the palace archives that would gather dust in some vault under lock and key. But someone made sure it slipped out. Someone wanted the world to witness what happened inside those walls. And when the footage leaked, it didn't just show a family argument. It showed the monarchy stripped bare. The video was grainy, but clear enough. You could see Harry leaning forward at the table, his voice rising, his face flushed with anger. You could see Charles sitting back, stiff, his expression cold, his hand twitching on the armrest as though restraining himself. And then came the moment. Charles's hand raised, sharp, decisive. He pointed toward the door. His lips moved. No audio, but anyone who saw it knew what he was saying. "It's time you left." Harry's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened. His body stiffened. He sat frozen for a split second, disbelief flashing across his face, before rising slowly from his chair. And the humiliation was unmistakable. He wasn't storming out in defiance. He was being dismissed. and the camera caught it all. Now pause and think about this. The monarchy has always controlled the narrative. From the gilded carriages to the balcony waves, everything is staged, polished, perfected. But this footage? This was raw. This was unfiltered. This was the king throwing his son out like a trespasser. And once the world saw it, no spin, no statement, no palace press release could undo it. The footage spread like wildfire. First whispered about in obscure corners of the internet, then plastered across tabloids, then replayed on primetime news broadcasts with experts dissecting every frame. Analysts slowed it down, zoomed in on Charles's face, on Harry's posture, on the subtle movements of security preparing to act. Some compared it to courtroom footage of a guilty verdict being read aloud. Others likened it to a father disowning his child on live television. And here's the question that gripped the world. Who leaked it? Because Clarence House doesn't just misplace footage. That level of access belongs only to trusted aides, senior staff, or security officials. Was it someone loyal to Harry, determined to show the cruelty he endured? Or was it an insider acting under Charles's orders, turning humiliation into a public message? That mystery turned the footage into more than scandal. It turned it into a weapon. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some viewers were furious at Charles. They saw a cold, unfeeling father choosing protocol over love, power over family. They said the footage proved what Harry had been saying all along, that the monarchy is less a family and more a machine. Others, however, sided with Charles. They claimed the footage showed a king finally asserting authority over a rebellious son, a leader putting duty above personal pain. And in that clash of interpretations, the monarchy's image fractured further. But here's the part no one could ignore. Harry's humiliation was undeniable. Watching him rise from the chair, watching his face tighten as he walked toward the door, the pain was visible. It wasn't the walk of a man leaving on his own terms. It was the walk of a man cast out. And in that moment, millions of viewers around the world asked themselves the same haunting question. If a king can humiliate his own son like this, what else does he do behind closed doors? The footage also revealed the choreography of security. Guards shifting just before Charles gave the signal. Aides glancing at one another, bracing for the order. It wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated. And that's what chilled observers the most. This wasn't a father losing his temper. It was a plan carried out with military precision. A message not just to Harry, but to anyone who dared defy the monarchy. You will be dealt with. And yet, within that cold precision, there was something deeply human. Harry's eyes. In those brief seconds before he turned to leave, they said everything. Hurt, shock, betrayal. The look of a son who realized he no longer had a father, only a king. That look pierced through the grainy quality of the footage, through the headlines, through the analysis. It connected with viewers in living rooms across the globe. Because beneath the pomp and circumstance, it was simply heartbreak. Now imagine Meghan watching that footage from thousands of miles away, seeing her husband reduced to a dismissed child. Imagine the fury, the pain, the vindication. For years, she had said the institution was cruel, unfeeling, unforgiving. And now the world had proof, caught on camera, played over and over again. If you were Meghan, wouldn't you feel both rage and resolve? Rage at the humiliation, resolve to fight back even harder. The palace tried to control the damage. Statements were drafted, advisors scrambled, talking points rehearsed. But it was too late. Once truth slips through the cracks, it can't be shoved back inside. And this truth, that a king could throw his son out after less than an hour, was now a global story. No gilded balcony appearance could erase it. No carefully staged photo could soften it. The footage had spoken, and the world was listening. But here's where it gets even darker. Some insiders claim there's more footage. That what the world saw was only part of the recording. That behind the closed doors of Clarence House, even harsher words were exchanged. That there was shouting, maybe even threats. And if that unedited version ever emerges, the monarchy could face a crisis like never before. So let me ask you, do you believe the footage we saw was the whole truth? Or just a sliver, carefully chosen by someone with their own agenda? Because whichever it is, one thing is clear. The leak wasn't an accident. It was a dagger, and it was aimed right at the heart of the monarchy. And as the footage played across screens worldwide, the consequences began to spiral. Politicians weighed in. Celebrities took sides. Public trust wavered. The monarchy, once seen as untouchable, suddenly looked fragile, vulnerable, breakable. But the fallout wasn't just public. Behind palace walls, the reaction was even more shocking. Because Charles wasn't done, the king, humiliated by the leak, began planning his retaliation. And his next move would shake the monarchy to its core. The footage hit the world like a thunderclap. Within hours of surfacing, it was everywhere. Twitter threads dissecting every frame. TikTok edits replaying Charles's cold hand gesture with ominous music. YouTube channels blowing up with thumbnails screaming.